A little boy sells his only toy car at a flea market to buy medicine for his sick mom, only for a billionaire CEO passing by to notice him. What he does next leaves the boy and his mom in complete shock. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching us from, and please like this video to support the channel. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. Owen held the small, chipped toy car in his hands, running his thumb over its once bright red paint, now faded from years of love and adventure. It had been his favorite for as long as he could remember, a gift from his mom on his 4th birthday. Back then, she had been healthy, her laughter filling their tiny apartment like sunlight spilling through the curtains. But things had changed. Now, her laughter was rare, replaced by tired smiles and quiet winces when she thought he wasn't looking. The doctors had given her a prescription, but the cost of the medicine was more than they had. Owen had overheard her talking to the pharmacist, her voice strained, her hands gripping the counter as she asked if there was a cheaper option. There wasn't. So here he was, standing at the flea market under the shadow of an old canopy, gripping his toy like it was the most important thing in the world. Because, to him, it was. It had always been. But not anymore. Not when his mom needed that medicine. He had taken his tiny collection of toys and placed them neatly on an old crate, but it was clear what the real treasure was: the car. His mom had told him to stay home while she rested, but Owen had made up his mind. He wasn't going to sit and watch her get worse. People passed by, some barely glancing his way, others giving him a quick smile before moving on. His heart sank with each person that walked past without stopping. He tried calling out, his small voice lost in the chatter of the market. "Toy car for sale! It's really special!" A man with a scruffy beard stopped and looked at the items before shaking his head. "How much for the car, kid?" Owen straightened. $10. The man let out a low whistle. "That's a steep price for a toy car." "It's important," Owen said, his voice serious. "It's my best one." The man hesitated, then sighed. "Sorry, kid. Can't do 10. He walked away, leaving Owen gripping the toy even tighter. Minutes passed. The sun grew hotter. Owen could feel his stomach twisting with worry. What if no one bought it? What if he had to go home empty-handed? The thought made his throat tighten. Then, a shadow fell over him. Owen looked up to see a tall man in a sleek gray suit standing in front of him. He had the kind of presence that made people move out of his way without him saying a word. His dark hair was neatly styled, and he held a cup of coffee in one hand while scrolling through his phone with the other. But something made him pause. Maybe it was the way Owen stood there, determined yet small, or the way his tiny hands clutched the car like it was a lifeline. Whatever it was, the man put his phone away and crouched down to eye level. "What are you selling?" Owen straightened, his heart pounding. "My car." He held it out carefully, almost reverently. The man studied it, his sharp blue eyes flicking between the toy and Owen's face. "How much?" Owen hesitated. Should he lower the price? Would this man walk away like the others? But no, he couldn't. He needed the money. $10, he said firmly. The man raised an eyebrow. "That must be one special car." Owen nodded. "It is. But my mom needs medicine, and we don't have enough money." The words were simple, spoken without self-pity, but they landed heavily in the air between them. The man's expression shifted slightly, something unreadable flickering across his face. He glanced down at the car again, then at Owen, then reached into his jacket pocket. "I'll take it," he said. Owen's breath caught. "Really?" The man nodded, but instead of pulling out his wallet, he took out a slim checkbook. He wrote something down, tore out the check, and handed it to Owen along with the car. "Here." Owen blinked, confused. He had expected a few crumpled bills, maybe a $10 bill if he was lucky. But when he looked down, his breath hitched. $10,000. His fingers trembled as he stared at the number. He wasn't sure he had ever seen that many zeros in one place before. His stomach flipped, and for the first time since coming to the market, he felt the sting of tears press against his eyes. He swallowed hard. This is too much," he whispered. The man's voice was calm but firm. "It's exactly what it's worth." Owen didn't know what to say. He felt like his heart was about to burst out of his chest. "Thank you," he breathed. "Thank you so much." The man gave a small nod. "What's your name, kid?" "Owen." "Well, Owen, you take that check to your mom, okay?" Owen clutched it tightly, as if afraid it would disappear. "I will." The man hesitated for a brief moment before standing up and ruffling Owen's hair lightly. "Take care of her." With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd before Owen could even ask his name. Owen didn't waste another second. He grabbed his other toys, stuffed them into his backpack, and ran all the way home, his small legs pumping as fast as they could. When he burst through the apartment door, panting and flushed, Emily sat up from the couch, startled. "Owen! Where have you been?" He practically flew into her arms, thrusting the check into her hands. "Mom! We can buy the medicine! We can buy all of it!" Emily took the paper, her brow furrowed in confusion, but when she saw the amount, she gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Owen, where did you get this?" "I sold my car," he said simply. Tears welled in her eyes as she pulled him close, holding him so tightly he could barely breathe. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You didn't have to do that." "But I wanted to," he said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "I just want you to be okay." She pulled back, looking at him with so much love it made his chest ache. "I am okay, Owen. Because I have you." That night, as he lay in bed, he thought about the man at the market. The man who had given him more than just money. He had given him hope. And Owen had a feeling he would see him again. Emily sat at the kitchen table long after Owen had fallen asleep, staring at the check as if it might vanish the moment she blinked. $10,000. It was an impossible number, one that didn't belong in her hands, yet there it was, real and solid between her trembling fingers. She should have been overjoyed, but a nagging doubt settled deep in her chest. Who was this man? Why would a stranger give such an extravagant amount for a toy car? It didn't make sense. Nothing about it did. But then she looked at Owen, his small body curled under the blankets, breathing softly, and she knew she couldn't afford to question a miracle. The next morning, she made the call. The pharmacy confirmed that the prescription was ready, and within hours, for the first time in months, Emily held the medicine in her hands. Relief washed over her in a way she hadn't felt in years. She had spent so long carrying the weight of worry, so long pretending to be strong for Owen, but now, for the first time, she allowed herself to believe things might get better. And they did. The improvement wasn't immediate, but it was steady. Within a week, her energy started returning. The constant ache in her bones dulled, the exhaustion that had once dragged her down like quicksand slowly began to lift. She no longer had to sit down after climbing the stairs, no longer had to mask her pain when Owen reached for her hand. Her laughter returned, real and unforced, filling their small apartment with warmth once more. With her strength returning, so did her determination. She wasn't the kind of person who could accept a gift like this without doing something in return. The first thing she did was call every place she had previously applied to, and this time, with a renewed sense of hope, she secured a job at a small design firm. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't high-paying, but it was stable, and stability was more than she had dared to hope for. Owen beamed when she told him. "That's awesome, Mom," he said, his brown eyes shining with pride. "Now we won't have to worry anymore, right?" Emily brushed his hair back and kissed his forehead. "Right, baby." But even as she said it, her thoughts drifted back to the man at the flea market, the one who had made all of this possible. Who was he? Would she ever see him again? James Reeves hadn't been able to get the little boy out of his head. It had started as a simple act of impulse. A child standing in the middle of a flea market, desperately selling a toy car, had caught his attention. But now, days later, he found himself thinking about that moment more than he cared to admit. He hadn't bought the toy for the money. $10,000 was nothing to him, but the boy's sincerity had unsettled something deep inside him. There had been a raw, quiet kind of desperation in the kid's voice, not for himself, but for his mother. It wasn't something James was used to seeing. It wasn't something he had ever experienced. He had grown up in wealth, surrounded by privilege, yet somehow, that little boy had carried more strength than most of the executives James worked with. And now, he found himself wondering if the mother had actually used the money. Had it helped? Was she better? James wasn't the type of man to concern himself with strangers, but for some reason, this was different. So, one evening after work, he told his driver to take a detour. The address on the check had been for verification purposes, nothing more, but he had memorized it without meaning to. It wasn't hard to find the building, a modest apartment complex tucked between the edges of the city. As the car pulled up, he hesitated. He had no real reason to be here. What was he going to do, knock on the door and announce himself? That was ridiculous. Before he could change his mind, movement near the entrance caught his eye. A woman and a small boy were stepping out, the child tugging on her hand, laughing. His laughter was familiar. James recognized the tousled brown hair, the same determination in his eyes. It was him. But it wasn't the boy that made James pause, it was the mother. Emily. She was nothing like he had pictured. When he had imagined her, she had been frail, exhausted, the way Owen had described her. But the woman in front of him was radiant. She still had a slight thinness to her frame, as if she were recovering from something, but there was color in her cheeks, a life in her expression that hadn't been there before. She was beautiful in a way that was effortless, in a way that made something shift in his chest before he could stop it. James wasn't a man who second-guessed himself, but in that moment, he did. He had planned to check in, to satisfy his curiosity. But now, watching her laugh as she knelt to tie Owen's shoe, he suddenly felt like an intruder. And yet, before he could turn away, Owen spotted him. The little boy's eyes widened, and before James could even think, Owen broke into a run, his small legs carrying him across the pavement. "Hey!" he called out, waving his arms. "It's you!" Emily turned at the sound of Owen's voice, her brows furrowing in confusion as she followed his gaze. When she saw James, she froze. For a second, no one moved. Then, James stepped forward, unsure of what he was going to say, but before he could speak, Owen blurted out, "Mom, this is the guy. The one who bought my car." Emily's breath caught. James extended his hand, the corner of his mouth tilting slightly. "James Reeves." Emily hesitated before shaking it, her fingers warm against his. "Emily Harper." There was something in her eyes when she looked at him, something wary yet grateful, and for the first time in a long time, James found himself at a loss for words. Owen, oblivious to the unspoken tension, grinned up at him. "You came to check on us, huh?" James hesitated before nodding. "I guess I did." Emily's lips parted in surprise, and for a moment, he thought she might tell him to leave. But then, slowly, she smiled. "Would you like to come in?" James wasn't sure why he said yes. But as he followed them inside, he had a feeling this was only the beginning. Emily had always been a firm believer in repaying kindness. No matter how hard life got, she had never wanted to owe anyone anything. It was a matter of pride, of dignity, of proving to herself and the world that she could stand on her own 2 feet. And yet here she was, standing outside the towering glass building of Reeves Enterprises, clutching an envelope in her hands, wondering if she was making a mistake. It had been 2 weeks since James Reeves had walked into her life, and in that time, everything had changed. The medicine had done its job, and every day she felt stronger, more like herself. She had started her new job at the design firm, and for the first time in years, she had enough to pay rent without worrying if there'd be anything left for groceries. But no matter how much better things got, one thing lingered in the back of her mind, the $10,000. It was a gift, freely given, but it didn't sit right with her. She hadn't earned it. And she couldn't rest knowing that debt still existed, even if James had never called it that. So, she had done what she always did when faced with something uncomfortable, she confronted it head-on. Taking a deep breath, she stepped through the building's entrance. The air inside was cool and sterile, a stark contrast to the warmth of her small apartment. She walked up to the front desk, feeling painfully out of place in her second-hand blazer and thrift store shoes. The receptionist barely glanced up. "I'm here to see James Reeves," Emily said, trying to keep her voice steady. The woman gave her a skeptical once-over. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Emily admitted, shifting the envelope in her hands. "But I just need 5 minutes of his time." The receptionist sighed, as if she had heard that request 1,000 times before. "Mr. Reeves doesn't take unscheduled meetings." Before Emily could respond, a familiar voice cut through the air. "It's fine, Angela. Let her through." She turned to see James standing a few feet away, his sharp blue eyes locked onto hers. He was dressed in another expensive suit, exuding the same effortless confidence as the first time they had met. But there was something else now, something softer. Emily swallowed, feeling the weight of his gaze. He tilted his head toward the elevators, a silent invitation, and without a word she followed him. His office was massive, lined with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. It was the kind of space that made her feel even smaller than she already did, but she refused to let it intimidate her. She placed the envelope on his desk before he could even take a seat. "This is for you," she said firmly. James arched a brow, leaning against the edge of his desk. "And what is this exactly?" Emily lifted her chin. "It's the first installment of what I owe you. It's not much, but I'll keep paying you back, little by little, until the full 10,000 is returned." For a long moment, James said nothing. He simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, with a sigh, he picked up the envelope and, without even opening it, placed it right back in front of her. "No." Emily blinked. "What do you mean, no?" "I mean no," he repeated, crossing his arms. "It wasn't a loan, Emily. You don't have to pay me back." Her jaw tightened. "I do. I can't just take money from someone, especially someone I barely know." James exhaled, shaking his head. "You're not taking anything. I gave it to Owen because he needed it. Because you needed it. That's all there is to it." Emily clenched her fists, frustrated by his easy dismissal of something that felt so significant to her. "I don't want to feel like I owe you, James." He studied her for a moment, then leaned forward slightly. "Then don't," he said quietly. "I didn't do it so you'd feel indebted to me. I did it because your son was willing to give up the one thing he treasured most just to help you. That kind of love is rare, and I respected it." Emily felt her resolve waver. She had been expecting resistance, but not this, not understanding, not warmth. She swallowed hard. "Still, I don't feel right just letting it go." James sighed again, but this time, there was amusement in his expression. "Okay," he said, straightening. "Then let's make a deal." She frowned. "What kind of deal?" "Since you insist on paying me back, let's start small." He grabbed his phone from his desk and tapped a few buttons. "Let me buy you and Owen dinner." Emily blinked. "Dinner?" "Yes," he said easily. "You want to do something in return for me? Then let me take you both out." She opened her mouth to argue, but he held up a hand before she could. "Think of it this way, you're not accepting charity. You're just having dinner with a friend." The word friend threw her off. It felt strange to hear from a man like James Reeves, a man so far removed from her world. And yet, something about the way he said it made it feel real. She hesitated, then nodded. "All right. One dinner." James's lips curved into the faintest smile. One dinner. That evening, Emily and Owen met James at a quiet Italian restaurant, far from the flashy, high-end places she had expected someone like him to frequent. The moment they walked in, Owen's eyes lit up at the sight of the massive wood-fired pizza oven, and Emily couldn't help but laugh as he eagerly told James all about his favorite toppings. James, to her surprise, listened. Not in the polite, distracted way adults often did with kids, but with real interest. By the time the food arrived, Owen was already halfway through telling James about his favorite superheroes, and Emily found herself watching them, something warm settling in her chest. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't worrying about bills or medicine. She wasn't thinking about the weight of responsibility constantly pressing down on her shoulders. She was just there, enjoying the moment. And James, for all his wealth and power, looked just as at ease as she felt. At one point, as Owen focused on his plate, James met her gaze. "You know," he said, "you should let yourself accept kindness once in a while." Emily exhaled a soft laugh. "I'm not used to it." James tilted his head. "Maybe you should be." She wasn't sure how to respond to that, so she didn't. But as the night went on, as she laughed more than she had in years, as Owen leaned sleepily against her shoulder on the drive home, she couldn't shake the feeling that, somehow, this man was becoming something more than just a fleeting act of generosity in their lives. And for the first time in a long time, James hadn't planned on seeing them again so soon. After dinner, he had expected to go back to his usual routine, the endless meetings, the high-stakes deals, the carefully structured life he had built for himself. But something had shifted that night. Maybe it was the way Emily had finally let her guard down, laughing freely over plates of pizza, or the way Owen had practically fallen asleep mid-sentence, completely at ease in James's presence. Or maybe it was the realization that, for the first time in years, James himself had felt at ease too. So, when he found himself driving back to their neighborhood a few days later, he told himself it was just a casual visit. Nothing more. After all, he had technically bought the toy car, he had every right to check in on its previous owner. That was the excuse he used when Emily opened the door, surprised to see him standing there with a small bag in his hand. "I figured Owen might want this back," he said, holding up the bag. Emily frowned. "What is it?" James smirked. "You'll have to ask him." She gave him a look but let him in anyway, calling for Owen. The boy came barreling out of his room, skidding to a stop when he saw James. "You came back?" Owen grinned. "Did you bring snacks?" James chuckled. "Not this time. But I did bring something for you." He handed over the bag, and Owen pulled out the contents, a nearly identical toy car, but this one was brand new, gleaming red and unscuffed. His eyes widened. "Whoa!" He held it up next to his old one, the difference stark. "It looks just like mine, but fancy." James leaned against the couch. "I figured your original car deserved a break after all those years. Now you've got one for special occasions." Owen grinned. "Like rich people have a fancy car they only drive sometimes?" James smirked. "Exactly." Emily, standing nearby, folded her arms. "You didn't have to do that." James shrugged. "I wanted to." And that was the beginning of something neither of them had expected. James started stopping by more often, always under the pretense of something small, bringing Owen a book he thought he'd like, dropping off takeout after a long day, claiming he just happened to be in the neighborhood. He never overstayed, never pushed, but somehow, his presence became natural, familiar. Owen was always thrilled to see him, and Emily. Well, she had stopped looking so wary every time he showed up. One Saturday afternoon, James found himself in the park with them, tossing a baseball back and forth with Owen while Emily sat on a bench, watching with an amused expression. Owen had insisted James needed more practice, after a near miss with a fast throw. "You know," Emily called out, smirking. "For someone who runs an empire, you're not very good at catching." James caught the next ball with ease and tossed it back to Owen. "I delegate. That's what CEOs do." Owen laughed. "That's a fancy way of saying you let other people do the hard work." James raised an eyebrow. "You're smarter than most of my board members." Emily shook her head, but there was laughter in her eyes. After the game, they sat on a picnic blanket, finishing the sandwiches Emily had packed. Owen, full and content, flopped onto his back and stared up at the sky. This is nice, he murmured, voice sleepy. It's like having a dad. Silence fell. Emily stiffened, her fingers tightening around the edge of the blanket. James, too, felt something jolt in his chest. But before either of them could say anything, Owen rolled over onto his side, propping himself up on one elbow. Almost dad, he added, grinning at James. You're not really my dad, but kinda. Emily groaned, covering her face. Owen. James, to her horror, didn't look offended in the slightest. In fact, he was laughing, his deep chuckle rumbling through the air. Almost dad, huh? He mused. That's a new one. Owen nodded. Yeah. You're not as strict as a real dad would be, but you do cool stuff, and you hang out with us. So, almost dad. Emily let out a breath, rubbing her temples. You can't just go around saying things like that, buddy. Why not? Owen looked at her, genuinely confused. I think Mr. James likes us. James, still amused, glanced at Emily. He's not wrong. She shot him a look, flustered, but he could see the hint of a smile she was trying to fight. From that day on, Owen's nickname for him stuck. James didn't correct him, didn't push it away, because, truthfully, he didn't mind. If anything, the more time he spent with them, the less he wanted to leave. He had spent years in boardrooms, surrounded by luxury, wealth, and people who only saw him as a business opportunity. But here, in Emily's small apartment, with Owen's toys scattered across the floor and the smell of home-cooked meals filling the air, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Peace. Emily still hesitated sometimes, still looked at him with guarded eyes when she thought he wasn't paying attention. She wasn't used to people sticking around. James could see that. But she was getting used to him, little by little. One evening, as they cleaned up after dinner, she finally said what had been on her mind. You don't have to keep doing this, you know. James, drying a plate, glanced at her. Doing what? Showing up. Spending time with us. You're a busy man, James. She met his gaze, searching for something. Why are you still here? He set the plate down and leaned against the counter. Do you want me to stop? She opened her mouth, then closed it. James tilted his head. Didn't think so. Emily sighed, rubbing her forehead. It's just. I don't want Owen getting attached if this is temporary. James studied her for a long moment before answering. I don't do things I don't want to do, Emily. If I'm here, it's because I want to be. She swallowed, looking away. That's what scares me. He didn't push. He just let her sit with it. Because no matter how much she tried to keep her walls up, no matter how much she tried to convince herself he was just a passing chapter in their story, he wasn't going anywhere. James Reeves had spent years building a life of control, of certainty. But with Emily and Owen, he was starting to realize that sometimes, the best things weren't planned. And that terrified him more than anything else. James had always been careful. He had spent his life calculating risks, ensuring that he never invested too much of himself into anything that could be taken away. Business was easy, numbers were predictable, people could be controlled with the right incentives. But emotions? Relationships? Those were dangerous. And somehow, without even realizing it, he had let Emily and Owen become a part of his world, slipping past the walls he had built so carefully. For weeks, he had told himself it was nothing. That he was just being kind, that he was only looking out for Owen because he admired the boy's determination. But the truth had been clear the first time he caught himself thinking about Emily long after he had left her apartment. It had been clear when he found himself glancing at his phone, waiting for a message that never came. It had been undeniable when he had started canceling meetings just to spend an extra hour with them, sitting at their tiny kitchen table, listening to Owen talk about superheroes while Emily tucked her hair behind her ear and smiled. And that was the problem. He had loved once before. He had trusted before. And he had been left shattered. James told himself he wouldn't let it happen again. So he pulled away. It started subtly, small excuses, and unexpected